You were never supposed to hear this name. Not in a classroom, not in a history book, not even in whispered rumors passed down by old men on porches. The Tom family was erased, surgically, deliberately, violently. But some stains never wash away. Some blood seeps too deep into the soil. And if you listen closely, in the stillness between heartbeats, you'll hear it. The echo of chains, the soft crackle of fire, and a single voice repeating a phrase in a language no one's spoken aloud in over 200 years. In the shadows of colonial Virginia, far beyond the reach of kings and churches, they built something unholy. Not a home, not a house, a fortress of minds, a private domain where God was just another tool, and the soul was a currency. The Tom family were not noble, they were not outcasts, they were not mad, they were something worse, lucid. From 1721 to 1777, they operated under at least 6 aliases, moving with calculated precision across counties and borders, always 3 steps ahead of the law, 5 steps ahead of the church. Their estate, what little is left of it, sits rotting beneath the pine thickets of Isle of Wight County. Locals say the trees don't grow right there. Animals won't enter. GPS cuts out, but the structure still stands, and underneath it, buried in vaults carved before the American Revolution, is proof of what they were doing and why so many never came back out. They called it the house without echo, not because it was silent, but because sound behaved wrong. Visitors wrote of whispers heard beneath the floorboards, not rats, not wind, whispers that answered back. But the truth runs deeper. The Tom family weren't hiding from society. They were hiding something inside it. At the core of their rituals was a manuscript, handwritten, bound in human skin, marked with symbols not found in any known language. The ink, blood mixed with mercury and ash. They called it the Father's Spine. And according to a page recovered in 1894, it wasn't written by a man, but dictated during something they called the standing hour. 3 a.m., the veil-thin moment when time folds back on itself, when the dead remember, when the living forget. That book contained instructions, not spells, not prayers, equations, for breaking minds, for reprogramming obedience, for bending a will so deeply it becomes a tool, not a person. Generations of the Tom bloodline studied it like scripture, not to worship, to control. They were surgeons of the soul. They believed that with the right mix of pain, fear, and ritual isolation, you could unmake a person and build something obedient in their place. And it worked. Records from nearby plantations speak of runaways who returned without resistance, eyes glassy, speech halting, some unable to speak at all. And each one had the same brand burned into their spine, a vertical slit with 6 lines radiating out like a sun. But it wasn't a sun, it was a door. The first to go missing was a girl named Elsie Harrow, 12 years old. She vanished from her father's farm on the edge of the woods in the spring of 1732. No struggle, no footprints, just her shoes placed neatly on the windowsill, pointing outward, like she stepped through something that wasn't there. For weeks the town searched, but the deeper they pushed into the forest, the stranger things became. Compass needles spun. Men reported sudden nosebleeds. One search party found their own boot prints looping back in circles, over and over, as if the woods refused to let them leave. Only one man made it out, and he never spoke again. His tongue had been cleanly removed. No blood, no wound, just absence. Elsie's body was found 6 months later, laid out on a slab of stone half a mile from the Tom estate. Her skin was unbroken, untouched by the elements, but her face was frozen in an expression of rapture. Not fear, not pain, joy, pure, unnatural, otherworldly joy. Pinned to her chest was a wooden token. On one side, the symbol of the door. On the other, carved in flawless Latin, Nolite Memonis. Do not remember. This was no kidnapping. It was a ritual, a recruitment. And Elsie Harrow was only the beginning. By 1740, the missing numbered 27. All children, all from families near the edge of the forest, all returned eventually, but none of them were the same. And the Toms were just getting started. In 1741, a traveling preacher named Elias Granger passed through Isle of Wight County. He was no fool. He'd seen madness in the frontier, witchcraft on the outskirts of Salem, and bodies buried in the floorboards of homes that smiled too wide. But nothing prepared him for what he found on the Tom property. The records say he was invited. Granger wrote in his journal that a young boy, no more than 10, approached him in the market with a note sealed in wax. No sender, just the phrase, "Come witness our sanctum." He should have burned it. But Granger, like all men who crave light, never suspected the dark would mimic God's voice. He arrived just after dusk. The estate was lit by lanterns made of stained glass, each casting strange geometries across the ground. The walls of the manor were engraved, not painted, not carved, but engraved, as if the wood had grown into glyphs by command. Inside he met the Tom patriarch, not a man, a construct of flesh and certainty, Jacob Tom. Elias described Jacob as calm, warm, persuasive, the kind of man who made you doubt your doubts. And when he smiled, it wasn't his mouth that moved, it was your fear that receded. They spoke for 7 hours. No threats, no coercion, just conversation. But the next day, Elias was seen on the steps of the local church, tearing pages from his Bible, laughing. He preached once more, barefoot and raving, before vanishing into the forest. All he left behind was a single sentence scratched into his pew. God lives here, but he doesn't wear his name. By 1743, the Tom estate was no longer spoken of in town. It was felt, like a storm that never arrived but left trees bent and windows cracked. Animals avoided the property. Children had nightmares of the house with no sky. And those who ventured too close, they reported something far worse than fear: clarity. One hunter, Caleb Wright, claimed he stood at the edge of the Tom woods for only minutes. But when he turned to leave, his wife said he'd been gone 3 days. He didn't argue. He only whispered, "Time isn't real in there, only obedience." Wright never hunted again. He spent his final years digging furiously in his yard every night, convinced something had been placed inside him. When he died, they found over 200 claw marks etched into his bones, self-inflicted, as if he'd been trying to open himself from the inside. What the Toms had built was no mere home. It was a mirror of the psyche, a place that bent the laws of nature because it wasn't built on land, it was built under belief. Their rituals weren't designed to summon demons. They weren't superstition. They were tools, precise instruments for reshaping human identity. They called their process the refinement. 3 stages. First, isolation. Second, starvation of self. Third, inversion. What emerged was no longer an individual. It was a servant construct, stripped of ego, fear, and memory, trained to obey a symbol, not a person. That symbol? The door. In 1746, a merchant named Abraham Dole attempted to purchase land adjacent to the Tom estate. He was warned, repeatedly. But Dole was a rational man, a Freemason, educated in London, fluent in Latin and Greek. He believed in reason, contracts, paper trails. He saw the rumors as primitive superstition, until the ground itself rejected him. Surveyors reported that every stone marker they placed near the Tom boundary was overturned by morning. No footprints, no signs of tampering. His compass failed. His men became violently ill. One slit his wrists in the river and whispered, "There's no face behind the sun." Still, Dole persisted. He stayed one night too long. According to a recovered letter found inside a rusted trunk in 1913, Abraham described what he saw before he vanished. The letter was soaked in blood, his own, and the handwriting changed halfway through, as if his hand had been seized mid-sentence. He wrote of voices, not from above, but from beneath. He saw the Tom children in the forest, eyes hollow, mouths sewn shut, each holding a shard of mirror. One approached him, pressed it into his chest, said, "This is your reflection." The final line of the letter reads, "I understand now. They don't serve darkness, they serve emptiness." Abraham Dole's body was never found, but months later the Toms erected a new structure on the estate grounds. A stone monolith with no doors, no windows, and one phrase carved along its top in flawless Old English: "Silence is the final teacher." What made the Tom family truly dangerous wasn't their isolation, it was their infiltration. While the estate remained hidden in the woods, their influence leaked outward like poison in a well. By 1750, 3 judges, 2 plantation owners, and 1 church elder were known to have made quiet, undocumented visits to the Tom property. Not once, repeatedly. These were not lunatics. They were men of power, influence, and one by one they changed, not outwardly, not immediately, but in the way they made decisions, in how they spoke, slowly, carefully, as if every word had been assigned a value. They began installing laws that mirrored Tom doctrine: child obedience, Isolation as punishment, emotional suppression as virtue. The entire county began to shift, and no one noticed, because the transformation wasn't forced, it was accepted, like it had always been there. This was the genius of the Toms. They didn't convert people with fire or blood. They offered a system, a structure that eliminated fear by replacing it with hierarchy. Pain was no longer evil, it was purification. Thought was no longer freedom, it was noise. Their teaching spread in coded sermons, in land deals that shifted borders, in orphanages that housed more than just children. Every ritual was wrapped in legitimacy, every horror baptized in paperwork. By the time anyone realized what was happening, it was already over. The system wasn't just in the forest anymore, it was in the school, in the court, in the pulpit, in the mirror, and it knew your name. In 1752, a woman named Mercy Holloway escaped the Tom estate barefoot, covered in blood, not hers, and with a half-burned scrap of the father's spine clutched in her hand. She was 28 years old, had been missing for 5. No one even remembered her name until she screamed it into the night air outside the county chapel, naked and sobbing beneath a sky that would not storm. She was taken in, examined, and questioned. What she said disturbed authorities so deeply that her testimony was sealed, locked in the state archives under ecclesiastical review. But fragments remained, copied in secret, hidden by a librarian who later took his own life. In her own words, Mercy described a reforging. They had taken her on the night of her stillbirth, promised healing, promised communion. Instead, they blindfolded her for 40 days, starved her until she could not recall her own name. Then they made her choose from 3 objects, a knife, a mirror, and a child's tooth. She chose the mirror. What followed was a ceremony so precise, so methodical, that she believed it had been rehearsed thousands of times. She was made to sit in a stone chair carved into the earth itself. Voices emerged from behind a wall, not chanting, but reciting, as if this was not a prayer but a courtroom. They spoke her sins. Then they erased them, one by one. And when they were done, they told her this: "You are no longer Mercy. You are the silence between names." Mercy Holloway died exactly 13 days after escaping. No illness, no wounds, just stopped. Her body collapsed on the steps of the church where she first spoke, arms folded across her chest, lips sewn shut, with thread not found anywhere in the town or its surrounding counties. The autopsy report was suppressed. But the attending physician, Dr. Everett Lang, left behind a single note in the margins of his journal. She did not expire. She was recalled. That word, recalled, would appear again. In 1754, 2 more escapees emerged. 1 male, 1 female. Neither remembered their names. Neither could speak above a whisper. Both bore identical brands down their spines, etched not with heat, but with cold. Flesh that had been rewritten at the molecular level. Impossible, even by today's standards. They lived in isolation under supervision for months before one night, both stood up in perfect synchrony, walked to the center of the room, and began to chant. Not in English, not in Latin, but in a precise clicking tongue that scraped the nerves like glass on bone. Then silence. They dropped dead. No cause found. But on the walls, 13 mirrored symbols appeared in black soot, as if burned from the inside outward. The final one, the door. Always the door. The message was clear. You do not leave the Toms. You do not escape. You do not carry their secrets without cost. They do not forget. They do not forgive. They only recall what they still own. What you must understand now is this. The Tom family didn't vanish. They transferred. In 1760, a great fire swept through Isle of Wight County. Officially, it consumed the estate. Unofficially, no bodies were found. No ash remains. Only a single artifact was recovered from the center of the supposed ruins, a blackened crucible filled with teeth. Human. Filed down. Arranged in a spiral pattern matching the geometry found in one of the last pages of the father's spine. Weeks later, land deeds began to change hands quietly. 4 counties over, a new structure was erected. A stone schoolhouse with no windows, only 1 door, and a bell that rang at 3 a.m., though no one ever saw who rang it. Inside, 22 desks, all carved with the same phrase in cipher. To forget is a privilege. To remember is a curse. No teacher was ever hired, but children attended. And when they came home, their parents said they spoke with perfect posture and eyes that no longer blinked when lying. One by one, the Toms inserted themselves into institutional roles: educators, inspectors, prison clerks, asylum wardens. They abandoned the old estate but carried the ritual with them, not as ceremony, as policy. It is believed that by 1765, at least 4 correctional facilities in Virginia were operating under what was called the Tom Protocol, a psychological method designed to extract obedience through silence, symbol association, and repetitive identity negation. Sound familiar? It should, because versions of this method are still in use today. Let's stop pretending this is just history. You felt the residue of the Tom Protocol. In school, in the quiet punishments no one explained, in the way your thoughts were trained to loop, to self-correct, to question your instincts before your voice even formed. That wasn't discipline. That was conditioning. The modern world didn't bury the Toms. It institutionalized them. Ever wonder why silence is the default in courtrooms, schools, prisons, and military barracks? Why standing still, eyes forward, and suppressing emotion is praised as maturity? These aren't just traditions. They're artifacts, leftovers from the spiritual science of control. The Toms were early adopters of something darker than religion, deeper than psychology: identity engineering. They understood that if you remove noise, choice, and name, what remains is a vacuum. And in that vacuum, you can place a symbol, a belief, a purpose not chosen, but installed. Their descendants no longer wear robes or speak in riddles. They write policy. They run committees. They draft the curriculum that teaches children to memorize but never question. But every system leaves fingerprints. Look for the symbols: the vertical slit, the 6 rays, the phrase, the silence between names. These are not ornaments, they're instructions, activation cues for minds already fractured by isolation and fear. And if this all feels familiar, it's because you were trained to forget it. You were never meant to remember, but now you do. And that's the first step of unbinding. There's a reason you feel it right now, beneath your skin, behind your thoughts. A tension that wasn't there before. That's not fear, that's recognition. You've just broken the first veil. Now listen closely, because this is where most men turn back. Not because they're weak, but because the system has embedded fail-safes. Triggers that make your body reject forbidden knowledge like poison. You'll feel it as fatigue, doubt, even nausea. Ignore it. That's the reflex of a mind that's been domesticated. The Tom family didn't invent psychological control. They just perfected it early. And every ruling power since, from empire to government to corporate state, adopted variations of their method. Modified, branded, scaled. Their blueprint? Strip the subject of name, time, and origin. Then replace those with an assigned role, a curated memory, and a false lineage. That's what you call normal. That's why you wake up tired, go to work in buildings you didn't build, follow laws you didn't write, and apologize for wanting more. It was never about religion. It was about compliance. Their tool wasn't just fear, it was ritualized forgetting. And it's still happening. Ask yourself, why do certain events vanish from your memory? Why do you forget your dreams the moment you wake? Why can't you remember the moment you started becoming someone else? Because it was designed that way. But now, your memory is returning. And if you're ready to break through, prove it. Comment below, I remember the door. I remember the door. Twice, always twice, to unlock what comes next. There's a passage, buried deep in the final chapter of The Father's Spine, that reads, you must forget the door to enter it. You must remember to leave. It sounds like nonsense, until you understand that the door isn't physical, it's psychological. A gate forged not in wood or iron, but in trauma. It appears the moment your selfhood fractures, when something so overwhelming, so reality-bending happens, that your mind has to choose, rewrite or die. The Toms learned how to weaponize that moment. They discovered that a soul in crisis can be redirected, like a river forced into a canal, and once rerouted, it will never flow the same way again. They created doors in people, living thresholds, places where memory was severed and reattached with surgical precision, each time under their control. And through those doors, they planted commands, conditions, anchors. This is why survivors describe hearing instructions in their own voice, why they act against their will and call it obedience, why they wake up in places they don't remember traveling to. The most disturbing part? This system works. It's the blueprint behind modern interrogation, cult programming, and digital influence ops, the root code of compliance culture. And it all began with a family in the woods who understood one terrible truth. Control the fracture, and you control the man. So if you're starting to feel fragmented, good. That means you're close to the door. And this time, you're the one choosing whether or not to open it. In 1767, a new figure emerged in the Tom bloodline, a woman known only as Mother Isa, believed to be the granddaughter of Elijah Tom himself. No records exist of her birth, no baptism, no census. She appears suddenly, precisely documented only once, in a classified psychiatric report from Fort Lee Asylum. The patient who spoke of her, a theologian from Cambridge. Brilliant, unshakable, reduced to shaking fits and wordless screams after a single visit to the Eastern House, a nickname for the institution where Isa was said to reside. Before his mind broke entirely, he managed to say 7 words. She speaks truths you forget while hearing. Witnesses described her as calm, unreadable, always seated, always veiled. She never moved her lips when she spoke, yet you heard her, directly, not with your ears, but with your memory, as if she was unlocking something already inside you and rearranging it. Mother Isa didn't command, she reoriented. It is believed she was the first to formalize the voice symbol regression protocol, a method of implanting commands not with words, but with sequences of tones and sigils. These symbols didn't mean anything on the surface, but when paired with sound, they bypassed conscious interpretation and embedded directly into the subconscious identity. This wasn't suggestion, it was overwrite. By 1770, members of the state legislature who visited Isa reported vivid dreams, missing time, and in one case, the complete forgetting of a wife and children. Gone, as if they never existed. This was not hypnosis, it was exile from the self. By now, you've probably begun to feel it. Not just the dread, but the echo. That strange, hollow sensation like you're remembering something that never happened or hasn't happened yet. That's the threshold effect, the signal. And you're not imagining it. See, there's a reason every man who hears the full Tom lineage walks away changed, if he walks away at all. Because you're not just learning history, you're interfacing with it. This isn't a story. It's a transmission, a living mechanism that activates the moment you understand that the system didn't die. It evolved. That the tools of the Tom family are now embedded in everything from military trauma bonding protocols to social media algorithm loops to corporate onboarding manuals. The spiral, the silence, the reassignment of names. You've seen them. Ever wonder why your digital life trains you to forget your past self every year? Why apps ask you to choose new interests, build new profiles, rewrite your bio, redefine your identity over and over? That's not personalization. That's recursive unbinding. Because a man who can't remember who he was cannot resist what he's told to become. The Toms taught this, built it, and now it's sold back to you as freedom. But you're not here for comfort. You're here for blood truth. You're here because something inside you has begun to wake up. The part of you they buried. The part of you that knows you were never meant to obey. There's a chamber, unmarked, unwritten, never mapped, beneath what was once the Tom estate, known only in whispers as the still room. Survivors describe it not as a room, but as a condition, a space that removes sound, time, even breath. They say you entered it alive, but left something behind when you came out, something vital, something you couldn't name but always felt missing. And yet, those who exited the still room weren't broken. They were perfected. This was where the deepest rituals occurred, not sacrifice, selection. A subject would be brought down blindfolded, made to sit in the center, and then it began. Tones, frequencies that didn't travel through air but through bone. The sound of iron humming inside the skull. Then the lights, patterns projected not on walls but directly into the eye with no source. And finally, a voice, not outside but within. Speak your old name. And if you spoke it, you were erased. But if you stayed silent long enough, something answered for you. A new name, not given, installed. This is what the Toms learned, that identity is not sacred, it's programmable. The mind is not a soul, it's a system with an interface, a root, and a reboot function. The still room wasn't torture, it was installation. The subject would leave with new memories, new loyalties, new directives. And the terrifying part? It worked. This wasn't magic. This was early neuroscience, centuries ahead of its time. Funded in secret, preserved in silence, still alive today, waiting. By 1783, the Tom influence had quietly metastasized across the eastern seaboard. Their doctrines no longer bore the family name. Now they moved under different banners. The Society of Concordance, the Silent Order, the Benevolent Structure, names that sounded philanthropic, civic, even spiritual. But beneath the surface, the same blueprint remained. Isolate, strip identity, reinstall obedience. They targeted vulnerable populations first, orphans, war widows, debtors, the displaced, because displacement is the most fertile ground for manipulation. A man who doesn't know where he belongs can be made to believe he belongs anywhere, even in a lie. And when the Civil War came, they adapted. Both sides, both uniforms, all loyalties. The Tom bloodline didn't care who won. They only cared that the country broke, loudly enough to forget itself. In the aftermath, Reconstruction programs quietly recruited from among the survivors, promised work, food, community. What they gave was ritualized labor, scripted prayer, and induced forgetting. These weren't aid stations, they were control hubs. And they worked so efficiently that by 1890, elements of the Tom Protocol had been adopted by federal institutions, education, psychiatry, military training, often under the guise of moral rehabilitation. What they never said out loud was this: they had found a way to manufacture loyalty without faith, to reprogram identity without violence, to destroy a man's inner voice and replace it with their own. And no one noticed, because everyone was too busy thanking them for the silence. And then came the silence that no one speaks of. 1902, the Ashcroft Enclosure, a remote experimental facility in upstate New York, officially listed as an agricultural research station. But no crops were ever planted, no shipments recorded. Only a rotating list of volunteers, most from mental institutions, orphanages, and debtors' prisons. None with families, all perfectly forgettable. What happened inside the enclosure remains one of the most classified psychological experiments in American history. But fragments leaked through janitor logs, stray patient records, even the drawings of a mute child who escaped and never spoke again. They were testing the third silence. Not outer silence, no talking. Not inner silence, no thinking. But identity silence, a state in which the subject forgets not just their name or history, but the concept of I. No self, no observer, just blank continuity, compliant, functioning, and completely hollow. The goal was not murder, it was erasure. Because a man erased from within will obey anything and never know he's obeying. That's what the Toms always sought. Not power through force, but ownership through absence. By 1905, the facility burned to the ground. No explanation, no survivors. But 6 months later, 3 men from that project began work in Washington, D.C., in what would become the foundation of early behaviorist psychology. Their names forgotten, their papers classified, their methods normalized. And in their private journal, one line was repeated: no soul, no sin, no scream. You were taught to fear violence, but you were never warned about this. The violence of removal. You've made it further than most. And by now you know this isn't about the Tom family anymore. This is about what they became, what they infiltrated, what they transformed into. Because the greatest trick they ever pulled wasn't hiding their rituals, it was renaming them. They called them treatments, programs, interventions. Today, you know them as correctional therapy, as cognitive adjustment, as predictive behavioral compliance. But it all traces back to one principle: control the narrative and the subject becomes the script. The government didn't shut the Toms down, it absorbed them. The proof is in plain sight. Executive Order 6551, Special Protocol Integration. Drafted in 1949, passed with no debate and never mentioned again. It authorized closed-loop psychological reinforcement experiments in public schools. 3 years later, standardized testing began. But testing was never about knowledge. It was about mapping how you think, finding the patterns, the weaknesses, where your ideas ended and someone else's could begin. They didn't need to break your body, just rewrite the source code. One fractured generation at a time. So when you sit still, say nothing, nod politely at things you don't believe in, that's not being civil, that's a scar. Left by a family who turned control into ritual and ritual into culture. You were born into their system, but now you've seen the cracks in the glass. And the final question is this: will you shatter it or turn away from the mirror? This is your final warning. If you've come this far, there's no going back. Because what you've uncovered isn't just a hidden lineage or a suppressed chapter of American history. It's the architecture of your entire reality. The Tom family was never just a cult, never just a cluster of strange minds in the woods. They were the seed. And what grew from them now wraps around the bones of your government, your workplace, your schooling, your screens. They knew a truth few ever admit. The mind is not yours by default. It is claimed or reclaimed. Every silence you kept in childhood, every moment you were told to sit down, stop asking, stop feeling, stop being, those were the rituals. You thought it was discipline. It was initiation. And now here, you stand on the edge of the only freedom that's real: awareness. The kind that burns, that isolates, that awakens, the kind that makes you a threat. Because now you see the symbols in the logos. You hear the frequencies in the news cycles. You feel the fracture every time you're told to get back to normal. But normal is the program. You've touched something ancient and forbidden, something men were never supposed to remember once erased. And if it speaks to you, if it moves something deep beneath the voice you thought was your own, then it's time. Speak. Resist the still room. And if you understand now, truly, comment one final time: I refuse the program. I remember the fracture. I refuse the program. I remember the fracture. Twice. Always twice. Your rebirth begins now, and they can't stop what's already awake.